The sound of the train's whistle cut through the silence of the night, growing ever closer like an unrelenting countdown. The scene unfolding at the edge of the tracks was like the climax of a nightmare where fate seemed already sealed. But what drives a person to act like this police officer? What turns someone into the executioner of their own humanity? And even more intriguingly, how far is a son willing to go to protect the one who raised him, shaped him, and whom he swore never to abandon? Have you ever wondered what happens when justice fails and the system that should protect becomes the greatest enemy? What's left for those who fight alone, without support, in a world where power and corruption go hand in hand? Perhaps the answers aren't solely in acts of heroism or violence, but in decisions made under extreme pressure. Choices that can change the course of an entire life, or perhaps many. The tension reached its peak. In the next moments, lives would collide explosively, revealing secrets and motivations that had been buried until that point. The question wasn't just whether the mother would be saved, but what price would be paid for it to happen. Who really would come out victorious that night? And what would the true cost of justice be? The train passed by, a deafening roar that made the ground vibrate, kicking up dust and leaving a trail of tension in the air. For a moment, silence returned, broken only by Malcolm's heavy breathing and his mother's stifled sobs. He held her tightly, feeling the fragile warmth of her body, as adrenaline still surged through his veins like fire. Help our channel grow. Hit that like button, subscribe, and activate the bell to stay updated on upcoming content. And we want to know, where are you watching us from? Comment below. But that brief moment of relief was interrupted by a threatening sound behind them. The metallic click of a gun being loaded. "Not so fast," said the officer, his voice cold as a knife's edge. He aimed the gun directly at Malcolm, a twisted smile on his lips. "You think you can show up, challenge me, and walk away like a hero? That's not how the world works." Malcolm slowly lifted his gaze, his body still positioned as a shield in front of his mother. His eyes locked with the officer's, which radiated pure hatred. The officer took a deep breath, trying to control the whirlwind of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He knew that any wrong move could be fatal. "You're on the edge, and you know it," Malcolm said, his voice low and firm, but filled with contained threat. "Drop the gun. There's nothing more you can do here." The officer laughed, but the sound was hollow, as if he were trying to mask the uncertainty starting to show on his face. "I can do whatever I want. People like me are above the rules. Who's going to stop me? You?" he mocked, taking a step forward. Malcolm stood still, his eyes fixed on the officer. He knew he had to stay calm, even though every fiber of his being screamed for vengeance. "The difference between us," Malcolm began, his voice sharp as steel, "is that I don't need to be above the rules to beat you." It was at that moment that the sound of distant sirens began to fill the air. Red and blue lights started to illuminate the darkness in the distance, quickly drawing closer. The officer froze, his eyes shifting between Malcolm and the flashing patrol cars. "Do you think you'll get away with this?" Malcolm said, leaning slightly to protect his mother. "They're coming for you. You've lost." The officer's expression of superiority began to crumble, replaced by something he never showed: fear. The patrol cars arrived with a screech of tires, and officers quickly emerged, guns drawn, ordering him to drop the weapon. What happened in the following seconds would determine the outcome of that night. The patrol car lights illuminated the dark scene like spotlights on an improvised stage of justice. Calloway, now motionless, looked like a cornered animal, his eyes desperately searching for an escape he knew didn't exist. He wavered between wounded pride and pure panic as the officers emerged from their vehicles with their guns aimed. Malcolm stepped forward, maintaining his protective stance, still positioned between his mother and the officer. He looked at the officers and, in an authoritative tone, declared, This man abused his power. He needs to be taken into custody immediately. Everything was recorded. You have what you need to ensure he faces the consequences." Calloway laughed again, but this time it was a weak, desperate laugh. "Recorded?" he repeated, almost as if trying to convince himself it wasn't real. "Do you think that evidence will mean anything? No one will touch me. I'm untouchable." One of the officers, an older man with a weary expression, stepped forward. He looked at Calloway with a mixture of disgust and resignation. "Not any more, Calloway," said the officer, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "We've heard enough. You've crossed the line too many times, and now your time has come." As Calloway tried to protest, nervously reaching for his holster, the officers reacted quickly. In seconds, he was disarmed and handcuffed, his bravado reduced to incoherent mutterings as they escorted him to the patrol car. Malcolm turned to his mother, now sitting on the ground with tears in her eyes, but with an expression of relief. He knelt beside her, gripping her hands tightly. "It's over, Mom. He'll never hurt you again." She nodded, but her voice was thick with emotion when she responded, "It's not just for me, Malcolm. It's for all those he's already hurt, and for those who never had the chance to defend themselves." Malcolm held up the recorder, the small device that had been his greatest weapon that night. He knew that this was just the beginning. The battle against Calloway had ended, but the war against the system that allowed him to thrive was far from over. Still not a subscriber? Join our community by clicking subscribe and activate the bell to receive a notification every time we post a new video. The sounds of the engines faded, the sirens began to quiet, and the night finally calmed. But for Malcolm, his mother, and all those seeking justice, that was just the first chapter of a much greater fight. As the patrol car lights began to fade into the distance and the chaos finally gave way to an uncertain calm, Malcolm felt a new weight on his shoulders. It wasn't just the relief that his mother was safe, but the awareness that the work was just beginning. Calloway was a symbol of a broken system, but he wasn't the only guilty party. Malcolm knew that better than anyone. Layla, still weak, but with a firm and resolute look, touched her son's arm, drawing his attention. "Malcolm, what you did here today was more than just saving my life," she said, her voice full of emotion. "You showed them that people like Calloway can't act without consequences. This is bigger than us." Malcolm nodded slowly, his eyes lost in the darkness beyond the tracks. He knew his mother was right, but he also knew that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. "This doesn't end here, Mom," he replied, his voice low but filled with determination. "Every person who helped Calloway, who turned a blind eye or stayed silent, they all need to be held accountable." Layla gently squeezed his hand. "And you will do that, Malcolm. But remember, you're not alone. There are more people than you think who also want change, and now they know they're not alone." The silence that followed was filled with the soft breeze that began to blow, as if the night itself was breathing after the whirlwind. Malcolm looked at his mother and felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. Not just for his mother, but for everyone who could be saved if he continued to fight. Malcolm's phone buzzed in his pocket, interrupting the moment. He pulled it out, seeing a message from an FBI colleague. Intercepted new reports. Calloway wasn't acting alone. "We need to talk," he sighed deeply, feeling the weight of the message. He knew that behind Calloway's capture, there was a much larger network waiting to be dismantled. He looked at his mother once more, his renewed determination shining through. "This is bigger than anything I've faced before, Mom, but I'm going all the way." Layla smiled, her inner strength radiating. "Then go, Malcolm. Do what you've always done best. Fight for what's right." As the night grew darker around them, Malcolm knew that this fight was only the beginning, but he also knew that with people like his mother by his side and unexpected allies emerging, the future, though uncertain, held the promise of change. As Malcolm and Layla slowly began to walk away from the tracks, the weight of the night still hung over them. The sound of their steps on the gravel was muffled by the silence around them, as if the world were holding its breath, waiting for the next move. Malcolm, still on guard, cast a cautious glance toward the darkness surrounding the station. He knew that the battle against Calloway was just the surface. That night had been a brutal reminder that the true enemy was a system that allowed people like him to thrive. Layla interrupted his thoughts, speaking in a low tone but filled with conviction. "You know this is just the beginning, right? What happened today is going to raise questions and answers that might be hard to hear." Malcolm nodded, keeping his gaze fixed ahead. "I know, Mom, but it has to happen. Calloway was just a symptom. The problem is much bigger." Layla stopped, forcing Malcolm to turn toward her. Her eyes, despite the exhaustion, were filled with something he recognized immediately. Courage. "And are you ready for that?" she asked, her voice firm. "Because fighting a system isn't like facing a man alone. It's messier, more dangerous." Malcolm breathed deeply, feeling the weight of her words. He looked at his mother, whose face was marked by the struggle of that night, and saw in her the strength that had guided him since he was a child. "Ready or not, I'm going to keep moving forward. I can't allow people like Calloway to keep hurting those who can't defend themselves." Layla took his hand, squeezing it tightly. "You have my strength, Malcolm. You'll always have it." The faint glow of the stars above them seemed to intensify as they resumed their walk. For Malcolm, that place would leave a permanent mark, a constant reminder of what was at stake. But he knew he had to keep going, because the justice he sought wasn't just for his mother, but for everyone else who had been silenced. As they walked away from the station, a new message arrived on Malcolm's phone. He stopped, pulled out the phone, and read. "Confirmed information. Calloway was part of a larger scheme. We need you to come to Washington immediately." Malcolm put the phone away and looked at Layla. She noticed the tension on his face, but didn't ask. She knew. Without saying a word, she nodded, giving him her silent blessing. The fight had barely begun, and Malcolm was ready to face it. Click subscribe and activate notifications. This way, you'll stay up to date on our upcoming videos and won't miss anything. The silence between them was thick, filled only by the distant sound of cars passing on the road. Malcolm felt the weight of his mother's words. He knew she was right, but the fear of failing, of exposing others to danger, kept him in a bubble of self-preservation. He had always carried the burden alone, believing it was the safest option for everyone around him. Layla watched her son with the gaze of someone who knew his soul deeply. She understood that his determination came from a place of protection, but she also recognized the limits of that approach. "I know it's hard to trust," Layla began, her voice low but firm. "You've spent your life seeing the worst in people, Malcolm, and after what happened today, I understand why you want to keep everyone at a distance. But son, fighting alone can consume you. You need allies." Malcolm looked away, crossing his arms as if her words were piercing through the armor he had built over the years. "You saw what happened out there, Mom," he finally responded. "The people in power. They manipulate everything, control everything. Who can guarantee I won't be surrounded by another Calloway, disguised as an ally?" Layla stood up, though her legs still trembled slightly, and walked over to him. Her strength was calm but unwavering, and when she touched his arm, Malcolm stopped. "Not everyone is like him, Malcolm," she said. "Just as I fought for justice in a broken system for years, you have to believe that there are others willing to do the same. Calloway is the face of what's wrong, but you are the face of what can change." Malcolm remained silent, feeling the intensity of her words. He knew his mother had faced battles he would never fully understand, but the fact that she was still here, believing in change, was a reminder of what was at stake. "I'll try, Mom," he finally said, his voice a little softer, "but I'll do it carefully. I need to know who I can trust before I let anyone in." Layla smiled, a small smile but full of pride. "Care is good, Malcolm, but don't let the fear of trusting paralyze your fight. Sometimes the strength we need comes from unexpected places." He nodded, relaxing his hands at his sides. For the first time that night, he allowed a small spark of hope to light up his determination. "All right. Tomorrow morning, I'll start contacting a few people. I have a list of names of people who already reported Calloway before. It could be a start." Layla nodded, her confidence in her son unshakable. "That's the first step," she said softly, "and I'll be here just as I always have been." As the night deepened, Malcolm realized that the real challenge wasn't just facing those who abused power, but also learning to trust the right people. The battle would be long, but with his mother by his side and the promise of allies, he felt more prepared than ever for what was to come. In the suffocating room of the police station, a new atmosphere began to take shape. The silence, which had once been laden with fear and uncertainty, now carried a thread of hope. Malcolm looked at each face before him, realizing that despite the initial hesitation, he had planted a seed. A movement was beginning. "All right," said Malcolm, breaking the silence. "If you're willing to move forward, you need to understand that this won't be easy. Calloway wasn't just a corrupt figure. He was part of a network that will fight to protect itself." Officer Reese leaned forward, his expression determined. "What's the next step, Agent?" Malcolm took a deep breath. He knew that to take down the network, he needed more than words and promises. Concrete evidence was needed, but that would require more courage and risks. "We need internal records, communications, financial transactions, anything linking Calloway to the others, and we need it fast. Now that he's been arrested, they'll try to erase the evidence." The middle-aged officer who had spoken before spoke again. "I have access to the record system. I can start searching for information, but I'll need protection. If they find out I'm involved—" Layla interrupted, her voice sounding like a pillar of strength. "You won't be alone. What you're doing isn't just brave, it's necessary. And bravery, my dear, always finds allies." The officer nodded, inspired by Layla's words, but Malcolm knew that more than that would be needed to keep them safe. He looked at Reese. "Can you guarantee she'll have coverage? And anyone else who decides to help?" Reese hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. "I'll do what I can. I won't let anyone intimidate anyone else." Malcolm felt a flash of relief, but the tension remained. He knew he was putting these people in danger, but he also knew that this was the only way to expose the truth. "All right," said Malcolm. "Start with the recent communications from Calloway and the incident records from the last 2 years. We're looking for patterns of abuse, suspicious calls, or anything that seems out of place. I'll also be in contact with the federal unit to make sure this doesn't get buried in a drawer." He stood up, and the whole room followed his gaze. "Remember, what we're doing here isn't just for you or for me. It's for all the people who trusted this system and were betrayed. For them, we need to move forward." One by one, the officers nodded, making a silent pact. The middle-aged officer began organizing the necessary steps to access the records, while Reese coordinated the first steps of what would be a long battle against corruption. Layla, watching everything, felt a mix of pride and concern for her son. When everyone left the room, she approached Malcolm. "You gave them something they haven't had in a long time," she said. "A reason to believe they can make a difference." Malcolm smiled slightly, but there was gravity in his eyes. "I hope they're ready, Mom, because this fight is going to be long, and Calloway was just the beginning." As they left the station, the light of day seemed to shine brighter, as if reflecting the start of something new. Malcolm knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he also knew that with determined allies and the truth on his side, the impossible could be achieved. As the car moved down the quiet road, the sky began to darken to a deeper blue, signaling that the day was nearly over. Malcolm felt the weight of his mother's words, like anchors that kept him steady amid the storm of emotions he was facing. He knew she was right, but the impatience for justice still burned in his chest. "The truth only appears when people have the courage to bring it to light," he said, breaking the silence, his voice filled with determination. "And it won't be easy with such a contaminated system." Layla smiled faintly, her eyes shining with the confidence she had always had in her son. "Nothing worth having is easy, Malcolm. You know that. You've faced obstacles before, and each time you came out stronger. This time won't be any different." She gripped the steering wheel tighter, as if channeling her energy into something tangible. "I can't make a mistake this time," he replied, his tone low, almost a whisper. "I can't lose anyone, especially you." Layla gently placed her hand on his arm, a gesture that said more than words. "You're not going to lose me, Malcolm, and you're not fighting alone. Don't forget that." Malcolm simply nodded, the intensity of his emotions making it hard to respond verbally. As they drove in silence for a few more minutes, he reflected on the next steps. He knew he'd need to expand his network of allies and gather even more evidence before the others involved in Calloway's scheme tried to erase their tracks. When they finally arrived at the motel, Malcolm parked the car and turned off the engine. Before getting out, he looked at Layla, his gaze filled with concern. "You'll be safe here for now, but I want you to know that if you sense any danger, anything suspicious, you call me immediately. Got it?" Layla nodded, but her expression showed she knew exactly what was coming. "And you?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Don't think I'll be sitting here while you face this alone. There are ways to help, even from a distance." Malcolm smiled faintly for the first time in hours. "I never doubted that, Mom. But now I need you to rest. Tomorrow will be another day, and I have a feeling it will start early." Layla let out a small laugh, despite the gravity of the moment. "All right, but don't underestimate me, Malcolm. Don't forget where you learned to fight." He smiled back, feeling strengthened by his mother's unbreakable spirit. As the night enveloped the motel, Malcolm knew the coming days would be crucial. He was entering dangerous territory, but there was something different now. He was no longer just reacting, he was taking control, and that changed everything. As the sun began to light up the sky in the morning, casting soft orange and golden hues through the motel room curtains, Malcolm closed his laptop, with his notes scattered across the table. His mother's determination was something he couldn't ignore. Layla wasn't just a survivor, she was a warrior, and he knew that somehow she would bring strength to his investigation. "All right, Mom," he said, finally allowing himself a small smile. "If you want to help, we can start today, but carefully. Any wrong move could expose us." Layla nodded, her gaze firm. "You know my style, Malcolm, always cautious but never backing down." He chuckled softly, admiring the courage that had always defined his mother. As Malcolm got ready to leave, he outlined the plan. "First, we'll revisit some of the victims I interviewed. Some of them were hesitant to speak before, but with Calloway's capture, they might be more willing now." Layla raised an eyebrow. "How are you going to convince them?" Malcolm pulled out a small notebook and placed it on the table. "Proof, showing them that we're not just guessing. I want them to know we have something solid, that their stories can help strengthen our case. Many of them suffered in silence because they thought no one would believe them." Layla leaned forward, her face serious. "When people feel they're alone, it's hard to find the courage. But if you show them they're not—" She paused, letting her words linger in the air. Malcolm finished the sentence, understanding exactly what she meant. "They can find the strength to fight." He tucked the notebook into his pocket and looked at Layla. "Are you ready for this? It won't be easy hearing what they have to say." Layla crossed her arms, her expression resolute. "I've been through Calloway. I can handle this too. These people need to know they can count on us." They left the motel shortly after, the fresh morning air filling their lungs. The road ahead was uncertain, But Malcolm felt that with his mother by his side, the battle felt less solitary. On the way to the first visit, Layla broke the silence. "Malcolm, you know Calloway isn't the end. Even if we achieve justice, this network he represents will try to bounce back." Malcolm gripped the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road. "I know, Mom, but every victory matters. If we dismantle this network piece by piece, we can expose the whole system, and that's already a start." She looked at him, sensing the weight he carried, but also seeing the strength he possessed. "And you won't be alone in this," she said. "No matter how big the enemy is, there are always allies willing to fight by your side." Malcolm glanced at her sideways, his mother's determination renewing his own strength. "We'll do it, Mom. No matter how long it takes or what we face along the way, we'll do it." And with that, the car continued down the road as mother and son prepared for the next chapter of their fight for justice. Want more content like this? Then hit like, subscribe, and activate the bell, because there's always new content here and you won't want to miss out. In the following days, Malcolm and Layla intensified their efforts, aware that the noose was tightening. Every document, every statement, and every piece of evidence added to the case against Calloway was one more puzzle piece unveiling the corruption network that had plagued Briar Creek for years. The tension in the city increased day by day. Malcolm began to notice distrustful glances when he walked down the streets, conversations that abruptly stopped when he passed by. It was clear that Calloway's allies were organizing, and the threatening note left at the motel was just the beginning. One night, while reviewing new testimonies in the small motel room, Layla made a discovery that froze the air in the room. "Malcolm, look at this," she said, handing him a testimony she had just reviewed. He took the paper, and his eyes narrowed as he read. The testimony came from a former police station employee, someone who had left the job years ago. It explicitly mentioned secret meetings between Calloway and powerful figures in the city, businessmen, politicians, and even members of other police forces. The group, according to her, operated as a network of mutual favors and protection, ensuring that everyone remained above the law. "This is big," Malcolm said, his voice tense. "If we can confirm these meetings, we can expose not just Calloway, but the whole system that supported him." However, Layla seemed concerned. "Malcolm, this puts you even more in their sights. These people won't stop at anything to protect what they have." He looked at her, his expression resolute. "That's exactly why we need to keep going. We can't let them keep intimidating more people." The next morning, Malcolm scheduled a meeting with the FBI agent leading the investigation. At a cafe in a nearby town, he handed over the testimony and explained its implications. The agent listened carefully, his eyes showing the gravity of the situation. "Johnson, if this is true, we're dealing with something much bigger than we expected. I'll need more concrete proof of these meetings," the agent said, carefully closing the file. "But be careful. The people protecting these kinds of networks don't hesitate to resort to violence." Malcolm returned to the motel with Layla, feeling the weight of what was coming. He knew the fight was escalating to a new level, but he also felt he was closer than ever to exposing the whole truth. When they arrived at the room, he found an envelope slipped under the door. Inside was a photograph of him and Layla, taken at the station days before, with a simple message written on the back: "Last warning." Layla paled when she saw the photo, but her voice didn't tremble when she spoke. "Malcolm, they're getting desperate, and that makes them even more dangerous." He clenched his fists, his face hardening. "This just proves we're on the right track, but we need to be more careful." That night, while Layla slept, Malcolm made a list of names. They were the people he knew still needed to be convinced to speak, those who had the power to solidify the case. He also added another item to the list: find out who took the photo. He knew that, with every move he made, his enemies were watching him, but he also knew that fear couldn't stop him. The next morning, Malcolm looked at Layla as she prepared for another day of work by his side. There was fatigue in her eyes, but there was also strength. "We're close, Mom," he said. "They know it, and that's why we can't stop." Layla placed her hand on his shoulder, a gesture of support that had always been a pillar for him. "You're not alone, Malcolm. You never were, and they don't know who they're dealing with." He smiled faintly, renewed by her determination. They knew the battle was still far from over, but together they were ready to face whatever came their way. Malcolm looked at his mother, feeling the weight of her concern. He knew that what they were up against wasn't just a local justice case, but a fight against forces operating in the shadows, protected by fear and influence. Despite it all, the spark of determination in Layla's eyes gave him renewed strength. "We'll face this together," he agreed, though a part of him wanted to protect her from all of it. "But I need you to promise me that you'll be careful. We can't give them more targets." Layla nodded, but her gaze showed that she was not the type to back down easily. That night, Malcolm spent hours reviewing the testimonies they had collected, cross-referencing the information with the new documents. He knew there was a bigger connection, but he still didn't have all the pieces of the puzzle. The words of the man in the SUV echoed in his mind. "The real players are the ones you haven't even seen yet." Meanwhile, Layla was investigating the victims who hadn't been contacted yet. She found a name that caught her attention. Eleanor Price, a woman who had reported abuse of power in another city before moving to Briar Creek. Her allegations had mysteriously disappeared, and she had vanished from public records ever since. "Malcolm, I think we should try to talk to her," Layla suggested, showing the name on her laptop. "Eleanor might have information that links Calloway to other cases." Malcolm studied the name on the screen and nodded. "It's worth a try. If she's off the radar, it might be because she knew too much." The next morning, they set off to find Eleanor. The available information led them to a small house on the outskirts of Briar Creek. The residence was modest, with windows covered by heavy curtains and a rusty gate that creaked as it opened. Malcolm knocked on the door, and an uncomfortable silence followed before a hesitant voice answered. "Who's there?" "Eleanor Price," Malcolm said, stepping closer to the door. "I'm Malcolm Johnson, FBI agent. I'm here to talk about the cases you reported in the past. We need your help." There was a long pause, the kind of pause that made Malcolm hold his breath. Finally, the door opened just a crack, revealing a woman with a tired but alert expression. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said quickly, trying to shut the door. Layla intervened, her voice calm but filled with sincerity. "Eleanor, we know you suffered, and we know they silenced you, but what you know could make a difference. We're not here to put you in danger. We're here to take down those who did this to you." Eleanor squinted, evaluating them. After a few moments, she opened the door completely, but still looked around as if expecting someone to be watching. "Do you have any idea what you're getting into?" she asked, her voice filled with distrust. "This isn't just about Calloway. There are people above, powerful people who make him look like an amateur." "Then help us stop them," Malcolm said, his voice firm. "We know they'll fight back, but every testimony, every piece of evidence gives us a greater chance of beating them." Eleanor hesitated again, but something in Malcolm and Layla's tone convinced her. She stepped aside, allowing them in, and quickly shut the door behind them. "All right," she said, breathing deeply. "But if I do this, you need to promise me you'll protect my family. Because once they know I've talked, they'll come after us." Malcolm nodded, looking her straight in the eyes. "We'll guarantee your safety, and we'll make sure they're held accountable." As Eleanor began to tell her story, Malcolm realized they were closer to the truth than ever before. But he also knew that the further they went, the greater the risks they faced. He exchanged a glance with Layla, who, even in the face of danger, remained steadfast by his side. They were ready to face whatever came, together. That night, as Malcolm studied the latest testimonies and the documents linking Calloway to a larger network of corruption, he couldn't help but think of his mother's words. Justice, he knew, wasn't an inevitable destination, but an ongoing battle, a war fought not with weapons, but with courage, determination, and truth. Layla, sitting in the small chair in the room, watched her son with a mix of pride and concern. She knew that Malcolm was risking everything in this fight, his career, his safety, and possibly his life. But she also knew that he wouldn't back down. "You're stubborn, you know that," she said, breaking the silence. Malcolm looked up, a tired smile appearing. "It's a family trait, Mom." She laughed lightly, but her expression soon turned serious. "Stubbornness can be a blessing or a curse. I just want you to be sure you're ready for what comes next." He took a deep breath, his eyes focusing on the documents in front of him. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." The next day, Malcolm received a phone call from his contact at the FBI. "Johnson, we've received an anonymous tip about a place where incriminating documents might be stored," the agent said, his voice low. "But there's a problem. It's private property, highly guarded. We need more concrete evidence before we can get a search warrant." "Understood," Malcolm replied. "I'll see what I can do." After hanging up, he explained the situation to Layla, who immediately showed concern. "Malcolm, this sounds dangerous. You can't just go in there without a plan." "I know, Mum. I'm not going to do anything reckless. But if there's something there that can strengthen our case, we can't ignore it." Layla hesitated but finally nodded. "Then let's do it right. Think through every detail before acting." Malcolm spent the next few hours mapping out the area, using public information and contacts to learn more about the property. It was an apparently abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, but reports indicated that people were coming and going at unusual hours. That night, Malcolm decided to observe the place from a distance. Layla insisted on accompanying him, despite his protests. "It's no use arguing with me, Malcolm," she said, grabbing her coat. "If you're going to take a risk, I'll make sure you come back in one piece." He couldn't help but smile at her determination. When they arrived at the location, they parked the car at a good distance and positioned themselves on a hill overlooking the warehouse. Using binoculars, Malcolm observed the surroundings. He saw two men exit through the front door, carrying boxes. "What do you think is in those boxes?" Layla asked, looking at her son. "If they're lucky, nothing relevant. But if we're lucky, enough evidence to take down this entire network." As they watched, Malcolm began to mentally outline a plan. He knew that to expose what was inside, he would need to act quickly, but with extreme caution. Layla placed her hand on his arm. "You know this is dangerous, right?" "I know, Mom," Malcolm replied, his voice firm. "But if we get what we need, it'll be worth it." At that moment, Malcolm felt a renewal in his determination. He knew he was stepping into unknown territory, but with Layla by his side and the truth as his ally, he believed he could face anything. The battle was just beginning, and Malcolm was ready to confront whatever came next. The confirmation that the newly discovered evidence could change the course of the investigation brought a mixture of relief and a renewed sense of urgency for Malcolm. He knew the next step would be decisive, not just for the case, but for the city of Briar Creek. The extent of the corruption was greater than he had initially imagined, and the ramifications threatened to shake the local power structures. That morning, while Malcolm and Layla reviewed the details, a new message arrived on Malcolm's phone. It was from an unknown number with a direct text. "Be careful. Someone inside the FBI might be leaking information to Calloway's allies. Don't trust anyone without proof." He showed the message to Layla, who read it with a serious expression. "This complicates things even more," she said. "If Calloway has allies inside the agency, you can't just hand over that evidence without making sure it gets to the right hands." Malcolm nodded, his gaze fixed on the phone. I'll need the special team to handle isolating the case. We can't let this information leak before we have solid arrests." A few hours later, Malcolm was on a call with his supervisor at the FBI, explaining the situation and suggesting the formation of an external team to protect the evidence and carry out the next steps of the investigation. "Johnson, your concerns are valid, but we need to act fast," said the supervisor. "This network isn't going to wait. If there's someone infiltrated, we need to identify them too." "I agree," Malcolm replied. "But we need strict surveillance on who has access to the evidence. Every step must be documented." The supervisor hesitated before responding. "All right, I'm sending a reliable team to escort the documents to Washington. You'll get updates with every move." As Malcolm organized the documents into numbered folders, Layla remained by his side, offering silent support. She knew what they were doing was risky, but she also knew they had come too far to stop now. "Malcolm," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I trust you, but I want you to promise me something." "What is it, Mom?" he asked, stopping and looking at her. "Promise me that, no matter how dangerous it gets, you won't do it alone. I know you want to protect people, but you need to trust those who are by your side." He nodded slowly, absorbing her words. "I promise you, Mom, but I'll do whatever it takes to finish this." Layla touched his shoulder, a simple gesture, but full of meaning. "Then finish what you started, but come back home safely." The next day, Malcolm personally accompanied the transport of the evidence to the federal office. During the trip, he realized that they were being followed by a black car. It wasn't a coincidence. He immediately contacted the escort team and changed the route. As the convoy headed to a secure location, the black car disappeared. Malcolm knew this was a clear warning. Calloway's allies were aware of his movements and would do everything possible to prevent the evidence from reaching its destination. Despite everything, the convoy arrived safely, and the evidence was handed over to a specialized team at the FBI. With the documents in hand, the team began dismantling the corruption network that extended beyond Briar Creek, reaching nearby cities and even state political figures. Back at the motel, Malcolm found Layla waiting, her expression filled with relief upon seeing him. "Is it done?" she asked. "It's underway," Malcolm replied, taking off his coat. "Now it's their problem, but that doesn't mean it's over. We still need to make sure every piece fits." Layla smiled faintly, pride evident on her face. "You did what you had to do, Malcolm. The rest will follow the right path." He sighed, feeling the weight of weeks of intense work beginning to lift. "And I wouldn't have done any of this without you, Mom. Your strength is what kept me steady." She placed her hand on his arm, her eyes shining with emotion. "Then, let's wait for justice together, and let's make sure it never gets silenced again." As night fell over Briar Creek, Malcolm knew that although the end of this battle was near, the fight for truth and justice would never truly end. But with dedicated allies and his mother by his side, he was more prepared than ever for what lay ahead. As the sun finally set over Briar Creek, the city prepared to start anew. The victory against Calloway wasn't just a moment of justice, it was a milestone of hope. Malcolm and Layla, bound by stronger ties than ever, saw the strength of resilience and action firsthand. Sitting on the porch, the silence between them was comfortable, filled with a mutual understanding of everything they had faced. The victim's message still glowed on Malcolm's phone, a reminder of the impact one person can have when they refuse to give up. "The world needs more people like you, Malcolm," Layla said, her voice soft. "And more people like you, Mom," he replied. "You taught me never to give up, and now the world has seen it too." As the sky changed colors, Malcolm knew the work wouldn't end there. There would be other Calloways, other corrupt systems, and he would be ready. But at that moment, he allowed peace to fill him, at least for a moment. This story is proof that even in the face of unimaginable adversity, courage and determination can change lives. And for all of us, it's a call to action. Justice doesn't happen by chance. It must be built, demanded, and protected. If this story inspired you, leave a like to support the channel and subscribe to see more content like this. Don't forget to activate notifications so you don't miss the next chapters. And let me know where you're watching from. We love hearing from every corner of the world where our channel reaches.